want to bring in Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, who's been one of the leading, not just public intellectuals, but fighters in the trenches. You don't really get that too often. Senator Vance, first off, you've got a piece up in the American Conservative, and I want to take some time and walk through this because this audience must understand this. This piece headline said how the Republican Party in the Senate is working on funding the Ukraine Forever War and to stop the reelection of Donald Trump. Now, I want to take our time and go through this piece because this is the type of kind of intellectual work that we need to frame this debate so people know what's going on. Can you walk us through that, sir?
Yeah, Steve. So first of all, just think about this in two phases, and we'll walk through each. There's the political phase to prevent Donald Trump from being elected president. And then there's sort of an insurance policy phase where even if he is president, this bill contains wording that would effectively make it illegal for him to discharge his campaign promises as president. But let's start with the political dynamic here. Steve, you saw this play out over the last 2 weeks. So McConnell and a few other Republican leaders come out and say, we've got this great piece of bipartisan policy, when in reality, the bipartisan border policy, as we've talked about, was a disaster. So step two is then to say, well, we can't advance this great piece of policy. Why can't we advance this policy? Because of Donald Trump, because of the MAGA Republicans in the House, and because of their allies in the Senate. So you do this two-step where you say that Democrats have done a great job on policy, and then you immediately turn around and say it's Donald Trump's fault that this great policy is not passing. And why are they doing this, Steve? They're doing it to apply as much political pressure as possible to House Republicans to get in line and support this Ukraine funding. And importantly, the fight is not even close to over. So you're going to have a fight over the government funding deadline, which will involve whether we fund Ukraine in part. You're going to have this talk of a discharge petition, effectively where a few Republicans give control of the House floor to Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House, to try to pass more Ukraine funding. There's going to be an omnibus package where I'm sure Ukraine funding will be on the docket. And the point is that the establishment's obsession with funding Ukraine will force them to throw Donald Trump under the bus again and again and again. This will be a nonstop rinse and repeat news cycle where every time the Republican Party gets close to standing on principle and beating back $61 billion of Ukraine funding, you will have the Republican establishment singing the praises of Democrats and then attacking our nominee. And of course, as we get deeper and deeper into the spring and summer, Steve, the political cost is going to be greater and greater. You know this as well as anybody, but there will be advertisements run against Donald Trump in swing states that say, look, even some Senate Republicans are saying this was great policy, but Donald Trump killed it. We know voters are really worried about the chaos of the Biden administration, especially on the world stage. They will run advertisements saying we had a solution to the chaos, but then Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans killed it. This is a constant structure within which they can drive down voter turnout on the Republican side and drive up Democratic turnout on their side in an effort to destroy Donald Trump politically. And I think, Steve, you're going to see this news cycle repeat itself. The particulars will be a little bit different, but the news cycle will repeat itself, and the goal is going to be to destroy a potential Trump presidency. Now, that's the political side, and we could go further into that, or we could talk about even if Trump manages to survive this onslaught, I think they've got an insurance plan, because I think that's important to talk about, too.
I want to talk about the insurance plan, but I want to go. Look, we had a massive audience all weekend of watching this, and of course there was spurts of activity, and then it was behind closed doors. Just explain to people what happened over the weekend, because I think a lot of our audience are shocked when they saw that. They were so excited when this thing was kind of voted down on Friday, I think it was, and then you held one of the votes open for 24 hours, and things started to shift. What is it about Ukraine? You called it a fetish. What is it about Ukraine, particularly when you see super MAGA states, Oklahoma, South Dakota? I mean, this is Trump country. These senators flipping. What happened?
Well, there are two things going on, Steve. I mean, first of all, to give credit to these guys, even though I disagree with them, some of them really think that this is like the Pearl Harbor moment of their lives, and they've got to stand with Ukraine in the same way that we stood against Nazi Germany and Japan. Of course, the difference is that was our country fighting against Nazi Germany and Japan, and Nazi Germany was much more powerful than Vladimir Putin's Russia. So the comparison doesn't make sense, but these guys have really convinced themselves. You know, they've read Winston Churchill's speeches, and they think this is their moment. Now there's also a less charitable thing going on, Steve, which is these people are all obsessed with going to the Munich Security Conference in a week and being able to tell their globalist friends that they stood and they got Ukraine their money. Now, it won't pass the House in a week, but I can't overstate this. How many of these guys want to go and hobnob with the Secretary General of NATO, and they want to sit there with the heads of states of various European countries, and they want to say, yeah, we've got some knuckle draggers in the Republican Party, but we did our job and we delivered that money for Ukraine. So that created this sort of tight deadline over the weekend and into this week, because this fight's not over, by the way, Steve. The most important vote maybe is tonight. So the fight's not over, but it's created this incredible time pressure where Schumer and a select number of Republicans have wanted to get this done. So, yes, the vote went down on Friday, but then there was this massive pressure campaign over the weekend to try to get this thing over the finish line. And I think that's sort of what you're seeing play out right now. And we're trying to basically put a pressure campaign in the other direction and say, look, we cannot let these guys, in the interest of Ukraine, destroy our nominee, create a constant civil war within the Republican Party, depress our voters, all so that you guys can get $61 billion for Ukraine. But that's what's going on here. And the thing I'll say, Steve, just behind the scenes, I've never seen the level of emotion from my even Republican colleagues about this fight for Ukraine as I have over any other issue. So you talk about the fentanyl crisis, you talk about the southern border, and yeah, people care, but it's not top of mind. There are some Republicans for whom Ukraine is the most important issue confronting the country. And I just say, even if you're pro-Ukraine funding, and obviously I'm not, don't we have 10 more important issues confronting this nation between the border problem, the debt problem? Why are we so obsessed with this? It is a fetish, Steve, and I can't pretend to understand it.
Just before we go to break, and we're asked to hold you through the break, here's what I understand. You have some of the most prominent hawks, including your son, you're a former Marine, you're for strong national defense, you got Lindsey Graham talking. You have, and they're giving speeches talking about we can't go back to our communities and our states when we have the southern border invasion. That is the debt in the southern border. This is what I understand. When these guys are reading their Churchill speeches, when they look to the guys against them, and some of these are people that, like Lindsey Graham's been a leader of the DACA. Just give me a minute on that. How can they sit there against the opposition and saying, we can't do this, guys. We got to secure the southern border, take care of our debt, and then we got to figure out Ukraine later?
Yeah, Steve, I'll say, look, there have been great people who have been great fighters on this. I mean, some people you'd expect, like Donald Trump Jr. has been sort of hammering this issue from the very beginning. But to your point, even Lindsey Graham, right? He and I don't obviously agree on the Ukraine funding question. He stood up repeatedly, both privately and publicly, Steve. He's been doing this in private, too, and it's been very effective, saying, how can we write a $61 billion check to Ukraine when we haven't done anything on the border? And we know the dynamic here, Steve. We have to force Joe Biden to do his job because he doesn't want to. We can't grant mass amnesty and call that border security. We're going to force Joe Biden to do his job. And there are a lot of even hawks, even pro-Ukraine people within the Senate conference who are saying, we got to focus on our own border first. I put Jim Risch in that category, like we mentioned, Lindsey Graham. And I think it speaks to something very deep here, Steve, where even if you're pro-Ukraine, a lot of people have got the common sense to say our own country's problems have to come first.
Senator, poison pills, you had them in the NDAA about taking away President Trump's ability to make sure that NATO shifts from a protectorate to an actual alliance. Is there anything we're missing in just looking at we got to get Ukraine funding to zero? Is the Republican Party, particularly Mitch McConnell, working with the administrative state to set traps for President Trump's second term?
Yes, Steve, and this is maybe the most important point, the thing I want your audience to most take away from what I'm saying here, Steve. In the Ukraine First funding bill, there is funding that is mandatory through 2026. Of course, if Trump wins, as I hope he will, He's going to be president on January of 2025. So what happens if Donald Trump decides to force Ukraine to go to the negotiating table? What if he releases some of the money, but not all of the money? What if he decides to do what a president has to do, which is conduct diplomacy? Steve, you heard it here first. They will impeach him under this legislation that may very well pass tonight out of the United States Senate. I cannot repeat this enough. The Washington Post has already reported that the purpose of the legislation is to control Donald Trump. So what they're trying to do is create a dynamic where if Trump follows his own campaign promises, Steve, they're going to say it's illegal and we have to impeach you. It's maybe reason number one why we've got to kill this legislation. We cannot pass a law now that ties Trump's hands in 2026 and gives Democrats an excuse to impeach him. But that's what way too many Republicans are talking about doing.